replacing the front control arms on an MK4 Volkswagen Golf, possibly applying to Volkswagen Jettas and Beetles as well. Because nobody should be riding around with a control arm with a bushing that looks like this. So the first thing we're going to want to do is loosen up the lug nuts on the wheel that we're working on before we jack up the vehicle. With the lug nuts now loose, and keep in mind loose, not off, we can now jack up the vehicle. With the vehicle up in the air, we can now proceed to take the lug nuts out and take the wheel off. With the wheel now off, we now have a full view of the control arm, and you can see right here that the bushing is starting to separate from the rest of the control arm. It's not quite as bad as the one I showed you at the beginning of the video, but it's starting to get there, so obviously it's time to replace this thing. So now it comes time to taking the control arm out. There's really just 4 bolts that are holding this thing on. We got one here, we've got the sway bar right here, and then the ball joint. Now if you look closely, you'll see that the axle is maybe less than a centimeter away from the top of the ball joint. Now obviously we're not going to be able to get a tie rod puller or ball joint puller in there, so you would think, well shoot, we're going to have to remove this axle to get that out. Well, I have a little secret that I'll show you here in a little bit. Now because I only have this side of the vehicle lifted up, the other side, the wheel is still planted on the ground, which means that if I just unbolt this sway bar is going to snap up or down whichever way it wants to, because it has a whole bunch of tension on it from the articulation of the suspension. So what I do is I put a jack stand underneath the control arm. I don't really care about this control arm because, you know, we're replacing it anyway. And I'll lower the vehicle down onto the jack stand to kind of alleviate the pressure on the sway bar, and then I should be able to unbolt this without it snapping back or doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Next, you want to take a 5/8 inch socket, start loosening that bolt. So now with the sway bar disconnected, we can go ahead and lift up the vehicle again to give us a little bit more room. Alright, so now let's focus on the ball joint. Now, like I said before, there's absolutely no room at all to get any tool back here, like a tie rod puller, to pop this thing out of the knuckle. There's not even enough room to get the nut off. It gets stuck in between the threads and this axle right here. So what we're going to have to do, we'll just loosen it up as much as possible, and then we'll get an extension like this, a 1/2 inch extension, make sure it's nice and beefy. Pop it right down into here, put it up against the, have it right there against the control arm right next to the ball joint, and we'll just give it hell with a mallet and try and pop it out. Alright, the nut on the ball joint is now loosened as much as it can. It's now coming in contact with the axle, so now let's start pounding this thing. I'm actually surprised this thing came out pretty easily. 2 whacks and it popped loose. Now, as a little secret, in the event that you're having trouble popping this thing loose, you can always get your a heat torch or a butane torch and apply heat right here to the part where the ball joint goes into the knuckle, and that'll expand this heat or expand this metal a little bit and loosen it up from the ball joint stud, and that should make it a little bit easier. I had to do that on the passenger side, but like I said, I'm still surprised that this came out in just 2 whacks. So now that the ball joint is loose, we can go ahead and continue loosening up this bolt, since it's not in contact with the axle anymore. So unfortunately, things don't always go as planned. Because this ball joint is popped loose, it's now just spinning, and I can't get the nut to actually spin off of the threads. It's just spinning inside. So, unfortunately, I kind of have to improvise. There we go. So now with the ball joint out of the way, we can focus on the last 2 bolts bolting to the frame. Believe me, these 2 bolts are going to be a hell of a lot easier than the ball joint. We'll start with this one at the front of the car. we should be able to kind of shimmy this thing out. There we go. And yeah, this one was definitely getting ready to fail, as you can see. Now it's time to put this nice shiny one in. With that one, I find it kind of helpful to get a screwdriver and try and align the hole. There we go. So that one's in. That one's in. We've got the ball joint in. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, kind of in. So now we bolt this thing back together. Now we can put the nut on the stud from the ball joint. And remember, the ball joint can't be up into place all the way because it'll come in contact with the axle. So I'm having the same problem that I was kind of having with the old ball joint, where the stud is just spinning inside the knuckle. So what I'm going to do is put the jack stand underneath this new control arm, put this piece of bark on top of it just to give it a little bit of a cushion while it goes down, and I'll put pressure up onto that ball joint to help keep it in place. I don't think we're going to need a whole lot of pressure, so let's see if that makes a difference. Yep. Now the stud is staying in place. Now we need to torque both bolts going to the subframe to 52 pounds. And that's it. The control arm is installed. So now we got to hook up the sway bar, and since this is already on the jack stand, we'll go ahead and lower it down just a little bit more, because as you can see, sway bar doesn't quite line up with that hole. There we go. Alright, and that's pretty much it. It's super simple to put this thing back in as compared to taking it out. So now all we got to do is just put the wheel back on and we're ready to roll.